She hid the fact she murdered her best friend 30 years ago, but she made a mistake. A secret that refused to stay buried. What would you do if you discovered that the woman who had been your neighbor for decades, who brought you casseroles when you were sick, who helped plan your daughter's wedding, had been living with the darkest of secrets? What if that same woman, who smiled at you every morning as she watered her garden, had taken a life 30 years ago, and that life belonged to her closest friend? In the quiet suburb of Millbrook Heights, Ohio, residents thought they knew everything about each other. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and the kind of community where everyone waves hello. It seemed like the perfect place to raise a family, to grow old, to trust your neighbors with your spare keys. But in March 2019, this peaceful facade would shatter when 58-year-old Margaret, Maggie, Chin made a phone call that would change everything. "I need to tell someone what I did," she whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible. "I can't carry this anymore. I killed Sarah. I killed my best friend 30 years ago, and I've been living with it every single day since." The person on the other end of that call was Detective Lisa Rodriguez of the Millbrook Heights Police Department, and what she heard that cold Tuesday morning would unravel one of the most carefully concealed murders in the town's history. The Foundation of Friendship, Sarah and Maggie, 1989. To understand how a friendship could end in murder, we must first understand how it began. Sarah Michelle Turner and Margaret Chin met in September 1987 at Ohio State University, both freshmen studying education with dreams of becoming elementary school teachers. Sarah, a bubbly blonde from rural Kentucky, was everything Maggie wasn't: outgoing, confident, and seemingly effortless in her ability to make friends. Maggie, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had settled in Columbus, was quieter, more studious, and often felt like an outsider despite her academic achievements. Sarah just had this light about her, recalled Jennifer Walsh, their former roommate who still lives in Columbus. She could walk into a room and immediately everyone wanted to be her friend. Maggie was different, more reserved, more careful. But when Sarah decided she wanted to be friends with Maggie, that was it. Sarah didn't give up on people. The unlikely pair became inseparable. Sarah helped Maggie come out of her shell, encouraging her to join the education club, to go to parties, to date. Maggie, in turn, helped Sarah with her studies, providing the academic support that kept Sarah's GPA from plummeting. Their dormitory friends remember them as joined at the hip. Sarah's spontaneity balanced by Maggie's careful planning, Maggie's anxiety soothed by Sarah's endless optimism. They were like sisters. Remember Dr. Patricia Holbrook, their education professor who taught both women in multiple classes. Sarah would drag Maggie to every social event, and Maggie would make sure Sarah actually showed up to study sessions. They complemented each other perfectly. I always thought they'd be friends for life. After graduation in 1991, both women were hired by the Millbrook Heights Elementary School District. Sarah landed a position teaching second grade at Westfield Elementary, while Maggie was assigned to teach fourth grade at the same school. They rented a small duplex on Maple Street, just 2 miles from the school, and settled into what everyone assumed would be a lifelong friendship. But beneath the surface of their picture-perfect friendship, cracks were beginning to form. The seeds of resentment, career, and competition. The first signs of trouble emerged during their second year of teaching. Sarah's natural charisma made her popular with students, parents, and administrators alike. She was asked to lead the school's holiday pageant, was chosen to represent the school at district meetings, and was frequently mentioned by Principal Robert Matthews as Teacher of the Month material. Maggie, meanwhile, struggled to connect with her students in the same way. Her teaching was methodical and effective, but lacked Sarah's spark. Parent-teacher conferences were stilted affairs where parents politely listened but rarely engaged. She watched from the sidelines as Sarah was invited to dinner parties with other teachers, while her own invitations seemed to dry up. Maggie started to change around that time, recalled Linda Morrison, who taught third grade at Westfield Elementary. She became more withdrawn, more critical. I remember her making little comments about Sarah, nothing too obvious, but you could tell there was jealousy there. She'd say things like, "It must be nice to have everything come so easily," or "Some people are just naturally lucky, I guess." The tension escalated when Principal Matthews announced in April 1993 that one of the teachers would be selected to attend a prestigious summer education conference in San Francisco, with all expenses paid by the district. It was understood that this opportunity would likely lead to administrative roles and higher pay. Both Sarah and Maggie applied, but the choice seemed obvious to everyone except Maggie. "I worked twice as hard as anyone else at that school," Maggie would later tell police during her confession. "My lesson plans were perfect. My classroom was organized. My students' test scores were consistently high. But none of that mattered because I wasn't bubbly and blonde and charming. I watched Sarah coast on her personality while I struggled to get basic recognition for my work." When Principal Matthews announced that Sarah had been selected for the conference, Maggie's carefully constructed world began to crumble. But it was what happened next that would plant the seeds of murder. The betrayal. Michael Davidson. In May 1993, Sarah began dating Michael Davidson, a substitute teacher who had been working at various schools in the district. Michael was everything Maggie found attractive: intelligent, bookish, with a dry sense of humor and a quiet confidence that reminded her of the type of man she'd always hoped to marry. More importantly, Michael had noticed Maggie first. "I remember him asking about the quiet teacher with the beautiful smile," recalled Substitute Secretary Helen Kim. He meant Maggie. He'd been watching her for weeks, working up the courage to ask her out. Then Sarah walked into the office one day while he was there, and that was that. Sarah, oblivious to Maggie's feelings and unaware that Michael had initially been interested in her roommate, pursued him with her typical enthusiasm. Within 2 weeks, they were inseparable. Within a month, Michael had essentially moved into the duplex, spending every night in Sarah's room while Maggie lay awake listening to their laughter through the thin walls. Sarah had no idea, Jennifer Walsh explained when contacted about the case. "She called me that summer, so excited about Michael, talking about how she thought he might be the one. She kept saying how happy she was that Maggie liked him too, how nice it was that the three of them got along so well. She had no clue that Maggie was dying inside." The summer of 1993 became a special kind of torture for Maggie. While Sarah attended her conference in San Francisco, sending postcards about the amazing opportunities she was discovering, Maggie remained in Millbrook Heights, alone in the duplex with her growing resentment. She would later describe this period as, "When the darkness started, I would sit in that empty house and imagine what my life could have been like," she told Detective Rodriguez. "If Sarah hadn't been there, Michael would have asked me out. If Sarah hadn't been so naturally charming, I would have gotten the conference opportunity. Everything good in my life seemed to go to her instead. And the worst part was that she was so genuinely kind about it. She tried to set me up with Michael's friends, or she'd share stories from the conference to inspire me for next time. Her kindness almost made it worse. The final straw, September 15, 1993. The murder occurred on what should have been a day of celebration. September 15, 1993, was Sarah's 24th birthday, and she had planned a small party at the duplex. Michael would be there, along with a few teachers from school and some college friends who were driving up from Columbus. Sarah had spent weeks planning the perfect evening. She'd even convinced Maggie to help with the decorations and food preparation. But that morning, everything changed. Maggie had been secretly applying for teaching positions in other districts, hoping to escape the constant reminders of her professional failures and romantic disappointments. She'd interviewed for what she considered her dream job, a fourth-grade position at an elite private school in Cincinnati that came with a significant pay increase and the respect she felt she deserved. The rejection letter arrived on September 15th. Due to the competitive nature of this position, we have decided to move forward with other candidates. The letter read. We were particularly impressed with the recommendations we received for other applicants, and we believe we have found someone whose teaching style and personality are better suited to our school's culture. But it was the next paragraph that sent Maggie over the edge. We want to thank Sarah Turner for recommending you for this position. Ms. Turner spoke very highly of your qualifications, though she did mention some concerns about cultural fit that we took into consideration during our selection process. Sarah had sabotaged her. Her best friend, the person who claimed to care about her happiness, had deliberately undermined her chance at a new start. The betrayal was complete. I confronted her about it that afternoon, Maggie later confessed. She was in the kitchen, frosting her birthday cake, humming some stupid song. She looked so happy, so content with her perfect life. When I showed her the letter, she just looked confused. She said she had only tried to help, that she told them I was sometimes shy with new people, but that she thought I was a great teacher. She didn't understand why I was upset. According to Maggie's confession, Sarah's response only made things worse. Sarah couldn't comprehend how her words had been interpreted as damaging. She kept apologizing, saying she never meant to hurt Maggie's chances, that maybe she could call the school and clarify what she'd meant. She kept saying I was trying to help you, over and over again, Maggie told police. She was so genuinely confused about why I was angry. And that's when I realized that she really didn't understand. She'd taken my dream job without even realizing it, just like she'd taken Michael, just like she'd taken everything else. She was so used to getting what she wanted that she couldn't see how her actions affected other people. The argument escalated as Maggie's years of suppressed resentment finally erupted. She accused Sarah of being selfish, of taking credit for Maggie's work at school, of stealing Michael, of ruining her life. Sarah, for her part, was devastated and confused. She genuinely believed she was being a supportive friend. Sarah started crying, Maggie remembered. She said she never knew I felt that way, that she thought we were happy living together, working together. She said she loved me like a sister and couldn't believe I thought she would hurt me on purpose. And that's when I snapped. The murder, a moment of irreversible rage. The actual murder happened quickly, almost accidentally, at least according to Maggie's version of events. The two women were in the kitchen, Sarah still holding the spatula she'd been using to frost her birthday cake. Maggie had been pacing, her voice rising as she listed every grievance, every perceived slight, every moment of jealousy she'd suppressed over the years. Sarah kept trying to interrupt me, to explain herself, Maggie told Detective Rodriguez. She said she wanted to make things right, that she'd called the principal in Cincinnati, that she talked to Michael about setting me up with one of his friends. She still didn't get it. It wasn't about fixing individual problems. It was about the fact that everything good was hers, and everything left over was mine. Sarah, in her distress, made the fatal mistake of reaching out to comfort Maggie. According to the confession, she dropped the spatula and tried to hug her roommate, saying, "Maggie, you're my best friend. We can work this out. Something just broke inside me," Maggie recalled. She was trying to hug me, to make it all better with physical affection, like I was a child having a tantrum. I pushed her away hard. She stumbled backward and hit her head on the corner of the kitchen counter. Sarah Turner died from a traumatic brain injury caused by the impact with the granite counter edge. But this wasn't a case of accidental death during an argument. What happened next revealed the calculated nature of Maggie's actions. She was still conscious at first, Maggie admitted. She was bleeding, disoriented, asking what happened. I could have called 911. I should have called 911. But instead, I stood there and watched her die. I watched the light go out of her eyes, and I felt relieved. The cover-up, a master class in deception. What followed was not the panicked reaction of someone who had accidentally killed their friend, but rather a carefully orchestrated cover-up that would fool law enforcement for 3 decades. Maggie spent the next 4 hours methodically eliminating every trace of what had happened. First, she called the guests who were expected for Sarah's birthday party. Using Sarah's phone, she left voicemails saying that Sarah was feeling sick and needed to postpone the celebration. She made sure to sound disappointed and slightly congested, as if she were coming down with something herself. Next, she dealt with Michael. When he arrived at 6 p.m. as planned, Maggie met him at the door with the story she'd rehearsed. Sarah had received a call from her parents in Kentucky. Her grandmother had taken a turn for the worse, and Sarah had driven home to be with family. She'd left in such a hurry that she'd forgotten to call Michael herself. "I was so convincing," Maggie later admitted. "I even had tears in my eyes when I told him. I said Sarah had been crying, that she was devastated about her grandmother. Michael was so concerned about Sarah that he didn't question any of it. But the most brilliant part of Maggie's plan was what she did with Sarah's body. The duplex they shared had a basement that housed the water heater and furnace. During their first summer in the house, Sarah had jokingly called it the dungeon, because it was dark and creepy. More importantly, it had a dirt floor in the storage area, a detail that most people, including Michael, had forgotten. Working through the night, Maggie dug a grave in that basement storage room. She buried Sarah's body 4 feet deep, then covered the area with old boxes, Christmas decorations, and miscellaneous items to make it look like a typical storage space. She cleaned every surface of the kitchen with bleach, disposed of Sarah's bloody clothes in a dumpster across town, and even baked a new birthday cake to replace the one that had been contaminated with blood. By the time the sun rose on September 16, 1993, it appeared that Sarah Turner had simply vanished. The perfect disappearance, fooling everyone. The initial missing person investigation was surprisingly brief. Sarah's car was found abandoned at a rest stop along Interstate 71, about halfway between Millbrook Heights and her parents' home in Kentucky. Her purse was missing, but there were no signs of struggle. The assumption was that Sarah had stopped to rest during her emotional drive home and had become the victim of a random crime. It made perfect sense at the time, recalled Detective Frank Morrison, who handled the original case and has since retired. Young woman, traveling alone, stops at a rest stop late at night. It was a recipe for trouble. We figured she'd been abducted, probably by someone who saw her as an easy target. The Kentucky State Police investigated the possibility that Sarah had made it home, but her parents confirmed that they had no idea she was coming, and there had been no family emergency. The assumption became that Maggie had misunderstood Sarah's phone call. Perhaps Sarah had simply wanted to visit family and had fabricated the grandmother story to get out of her birthday party obligations. Sarah wasn't always the most responsible person, admitted her college friend Jennifer Walsh. She was spontaneous, sometimes flighty. The idea that she might have just decided to take an impromptu trip wasn't completely out of character. We were worried, but we also thought she might just show up in a few days with some crazy story about an adventure. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Sarah Turner never came home. Maggie played the role of the worried best friend perfectly. She cooperated fully with police, provided them with names of Sarah's friends and family members, and even organized a search party that combed the woods around the rest stop where Sarah's car had been found. She appeared on local news broadcasts, tearfully pleading for information about her missing roommate. She was so convincing, Detective Morrison recalled. She seemed genuinely devastated by Sarah's disappearance. She kept the missing person flyers up in the teacher's lounge for months. She'd bring up Sarah in conversations, wondering aloud what might have happened to her. If she was acting, she deserved an Academy Award. The case went cold within 6 months. Without a body, without witnesses, and without any evidence of foul play, there was simply nothing for investigators to pursue. Sarah Turner had become one of the thousands of people who disappear each year in America, leaving behind only questions and grief. Building a new life, the next 30 years. With Sarah gone, Maggie's life began to improve almost immediately. Michael, devastated by his girlfriend's disappearance, leaned on Maggie for emotional support. She was there for him during his darkest moments, offering comfort and understanding in ways that felt natural and unforced. Maggie was incredible during that time, Michael would later tell investigators. She was grieving too, but she put her own pain aside to help me deal with mine. She'd listen to me talk about Sarah for hours, look at photos with me, help me write letters to Sarah's parents. I don't know how I would have gotten through it without her. 18 months after Sarah's disappearance, Michael and Maggie began dating. It felt natural to both of them. They'd grown close during the search for Sarah, and their shared grief had created a bond that gradually evolved into something deeper. They married in 1996, in a small ceremony that felt appropriate given the shadow that Sarah's disappearance still cast over their lives. I felt guilty about being happy, Maggie confessed years later. But I also felt like I finally had the life I was supposed to have. Michael was supposed to be with me from the beginning. Sarah's disappearance had just corrected the universe. Professionally, Maggie's career also began to flourish. With Sarah gone, she became the natural choice for leadership roles at Westfield Elementary. She was promoted to grade-level coordinator in 1994, then to assistant principal in 1998. By 2005, she was the principal of her own school, Millbrook Heights Elementary, a new facility built to accommodate the town's growing population. Maggie and Michael had 2 children, Emily, born in 1997, and David, born in 2000. They bought a house in the same neighborhood where they'd shared the duplex with Sarah, but on a different street with better schools and larger yards. From the outside, they looked like the perfect family, successful, attractive, involved in their community. "The Davidsons were model citizens," said neighbor Patricia Holmes, who lived across the street from the family for 15 years. "Maggie was always organizing neighborhood cleanups. Michael coached Little League. Their kids were polite and well-behaved. If you had asked me to name the most stable, trustworthy family on our block, it would have been them." But beneath this perfect exterior, Maggie was carrying a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. The weight of secrets, living with murder. For 30 years, Maggie Davidson, née Chin, carried the knowledge of what she had done. She told herself that it had been an accident, that she hadn't meant to kill Sarah, that she was simply a victim of circumstance who had made the best of a terrible situation. But there were moments, usually in the quiet hours before dawn, when the full weight of her actions would settle on her chest like a physical thing. "I dreamed about her almost every night for the first 5 years," Maggie told Detective Rodriguez. "Sarah would be in the kitchen, frosting her birthday cake, and she'd look up at me and ask why I let her die. Sometimes she'd be angry, sometimes she'd just be sad. But she was always there, just under the surface of my consciousness." The guilt manifested in unexpected ways. Maggie became obsessively involved in charity work, as if good deeds could somehow balance the cosmic scales. She volunteered at homeless shelters, organized food drives, and donated generously to causes that helped missing persons' families. She told herself that she was honoring Sarah's memory, but deep down she knew she was trying to atone for the unforgivable. "Maggie was always the first person to volunteer for anything," recalled Susan Martinez, who worked with her on several charity committees. "School fundraisers, community events, church activities, she was everywhere, always helping. I used to joke that she was trying to single-handedly save the world. Looking back now, I wonder if she was trying to save herself." The strain of maintaining her secret also took a toll on her relationships. Michael, despite his love for Maggie, sometimes noticed moments when she seemed distant, almost haunted. She would stare off into space during conversations, or wake up in the middle of the night and sit by the window for hours. "There were times when I felt like I didn't really know her," Michael admitted to investigators. "She'd get this look on her face, like she was seeing something I couldn't see. When I'd ask her about it, she'd just say she was thinking about work, or worrying about the kids. I accepted that explanation because I loved her, but there was always this feeling that there was something she wasn't telling me." The secret also created an insurmountable barrier between Maggie and her children. She loved Emily and David desperately, but she could never fully open herself to them, knowing that her entire adult life was built on a lie. She was a good mother, attentive, supportive, present, but there was always a part of herself that she held back. "Mom was always a little sad," Emily Davidson, now 27, told reporters after her mother's arrest. "Even during happy moments, birthdays, holidays, family vacations, there was this underlying melancholy about her. Dad used to say she was just naturally introspective, but it was more than that. It was like she was always apologizing for something, even when she hadn't done anything wrong." The mistake, technology and DNA. For 29 years, Maggie's secret remained buried both literally and figuratively. Sarah's body lay undisturbed in the basement of the duplex, which had been converted to apartments after Maggie and Michael moved out. The current owners had never had reason to excavate the basement storage area, and the case of Sarah Turner's disappearance had long since been filed away as a cold case. But in 2018, Advances in DNA technology and a new initiative to revisit cold cases brought Sarah's disappearance back into the spotlight. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation had begun using genetic genealogy to solve decades-old crimes, and Sarah's case was selected as part of a pilot program. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had been assigned to review the case files and determine whether there was any biological evidence that could be tested using modern techniques. What she found was a single hair that had been collected from Sarah's car when it was discovered at the rest stop. A hair that had been too degraded for testing in 1993, but might yield results with current technology. We weren't expecting much, Detective Rodriguez explained. The hair sample was minimal, and it had been stored for almost 30 years. But the new testing methods are incredibly sensitive. We thought it was worth a shot. The results were surprising. The hair didn't belong to Sarah Turner, as investigators had assumed. It belonged to an unknown female, and the DNA profile was entered into the national database to search for matches. There were no hits in the criminal database, but the genealogy website GDmatch provided a lead that would eventually unravel Maggie's carefully constructed lie. The DNA profile from the hair matched several distant relatives who had uploaded their genetic information to genealogy websites. Through a process of building family trees and eliminating possibilities, investigators were able to narrow down the potential sources of the DNA to a handful of women in the Ohio area. Margaret Davidson, Nachin, was one of them. When we first identified her as a potential source, it seemed like a long shot, Detective Rodriguez admitted. She was Sarah's best friend and roommate. We assumed the hair had gotten into Sarah's car innocently. Maybe Sarah had borrowed a jacket, or they'd shared a car at some point. But we had to follow up on every lead. The follow-up investigation revealed inconsistencies in Maggie's original statements that had gone unnoticed in 1993. She had told police that Sarah left for Kentucky around 4 p.m. on September 15th. But Michael's statement indicated that he had spoken to Sarah on the phone at 3:30 p.m., and she had sounded normal and excited about her birthday party that evening. Moreover, a review of phone records from 1993 showed that no calls had been made from Sarah's apartment to her parents in Kentucky on September 15th or 16th. The emergency that had supposedly prompted Sarah's sudden departure had never been reported to her family. The more we looked at the details, the more questions we had, Detective Rodriguez explained. Maggie had been very helpful in 1993, but her story had some holes that nobody had thought to investigate at the time. The assumption was that she was a grieving friend who was trying to be helpful. Nobody suspected that she might be lying. The confrontation, 30 years of guilt collapses. Detective Rodriguez's decision to approach Maggie directly was based on both investigative strategy and intuition. The DNA evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. The hair could have been transferred innocently, and building a murder case around it would be challenging without additional evidence. But Rodriguez had spent enough time with guilty suspects to recognize the signs of someone carrying a heavy secret. I decided to take a direct approach, Rodriguez explained. I called her and asked if she would be willing to come in and discuss some new developments in Sarah's case. I told her we were reviewing all the cold cases and wanted to make sure we hadn't missed anything. She agreed immediately, which was either very good news or very bad news from an investigative standpoint. The interview was scheduled for March 12, 2019, at the Millbrook Heights Police Department. Maggie arrived 15 minutes early, impeccably dressed in a dark blue suit that projected competence and respectability. She carried a manila folder containing newspaper clippings about Sarah's disappearance, photos from their college years, and copies of the missing person flyers she had distributed in 1993. She looked like she was attending a business meeting, Detective Rodriguez recalled. Very composed, very professional. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at the door like she was calculating escape routes. She was scared, but trying hard not to show it. The interview began routinely, with Rodriguez asking Maggie to walk through the events of September 15, 1993, one more time. Maggie repeated the same story she had told 30 years earlier. Sarah had received a phone call about her grandmother, had become upset, and had decided to drive home to Kentucky immediately. But when Rodriguez mentioned the DNA evidence from the hair found in Sarah's car, Maggie's carefully maintained composure began to crack. I watched her face when I mentioned the DNA, Rodriguez said. She went completely white. She started blinking rapidly, and her hands started shaking. She asked what the DNA had to do with anything, and I explained that we were trying to identify everyone who might have been in contact with Sarah's car around the time of her disappearance. Rodriguez then delivered the crucial piece of information. We know you were in Sarah's car, Maggie. Your DNA is there. What I need to understand is when and why you were in that car. The question hung in the air between them for what felt like an eternity. Maggie stared at her hands, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears. I never meant to hurt her, she whispered. It was an accident. Everything that happened after was just... I was scared. I was so scared. The confession. 3 decades of truth. What followed was a detailed confession that lasted over 4 hours. Detective Rodriguez later described it as one of the most emotionally devastating interviews of her career. Maggie spoke in a monotone voice, as if reciting a story that had played in her head thousands of times, finally able to share the burden that had consumed her life. She described the argument, the push, the moment when Sarah's head hit the counter. She talked about standing there, watching her friend die, and making the conscious decision not to call for help. She detailed the cover-up, the burial, the elaborate lies told to Michael and to the police. She was incredibly detailed, Rodriguez noted. She remembered conversations word for word, described exactly how she had cleaned the crime scene, even drew a diagram of where she had buried the body. It was clear that she had been rehearsing this confession in her mind for years. But it was Maggie's description of the aftermath that was most chilling. She spoke about attending Sarah's memorial service, comforting Sarah's parents, and helping to establish a scholarship fund in Sarah's name. She had even given a eulogy, standing at the podium and talking about her dear friend, while knowing exactly where Sarah's body lay. The hardest part wasn't the lying, Maggie told Rodriguez. It was the way everyone treated me like a victim too. Sarah's parents would hug me and tell me how glad they were that Sarah had such a good friend. Michael would say that I was the only person who understood what he was going through. I became the keeper of Sarah's memory, the person everyone turned to when they wanted to talk about her. And every single conversation was like a knife in my chest. The confession also revealed the psychological toll that the secret had taken on Maggie over the years. She described periods of depression, anxiety attacks, and an overwhelming sense of guilt that had shaped every decision she had made for 3 decades. I tried to be the person Sarah would have wanted me to be, she said. I became a better teacher, a better mother, a better community member. I thought if I could just do enough good things, Maybe I could balance out the bad. But it never worked. Every good thing I did just reminded me that Sarah would never get the chance to do good things of her own. The investigation, confirming the truth. While Maggie's confession was detailed and convincing, Detective Rodriguez knew that she needed physical evidence to support the charges. The first step was obtaining a search warrant for the basement of the duplex on Maple Street, which was now owned by a young couple who had no idea about the property's dark history. We explained to the current owners that we needed to excavate part of their basement as part of a cold case investigation, Rodriguez explained. They were incredibly cooperative, though obviously shocked. They'd been living above Sarah's grave for 5 years without knowing it. The excavation took place on March 20th, 2019, exactly 1 week after Maggie's confession. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, investigators quickly located the area where Sarah's remains had been buried. The dogs hit on the exact spot that Maggie had described, and radar showed a clear anomaly in the soil. It was exactly where she said it would be, Rodriguez recalled. 4 feet down, in the northeast corner of the storage room. The soil was different, darker, more compacted. Someone had definitely been digging there. The excavation revealed Sarah Turner's remains in a remarkably good state of preservation. The dry basement environment had essentially mummified the body, allowing forensic experts to confirm both the identity and the cause of death. Sarah's skull showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma consistent with Maggie's description of the incident. More importantly, the physical evidence supported Maggie's claim that Sarah's death had occurred in the kitchen of the duplex. Soil samples from around the body contained traces of cleaning products, specifically bleach, suggesting that contaminated materials had been buried along with the remains. The forensic evidence told the same story as the confession, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic anthropologist who examined Sarah's remains. The skull fracture was consistent with impact against a hard, angular surface like a granite countertop. The location and angle of the injury supported the claim that it had occurred during a backward fall. From a purely medical standpoint, this death could have been accidental. The legal proceedings, justice delayed but not denied. Margaret Davidson was arrested on March 22, 2019, and charged with murder in the second degree, tampering with evidence, and filing false police reports. The case garnered national media attention, both because of the 30-year gap between the crime and the arrest, and because of the seemingly ordinary suburban mother who had been living with such an extraordinary secret. "It was surreal," said her defense attorney, Robert Chin, no relation. Here was this woman who had been a pillar of her community for decades, who had raised 2 successful children, who had devoted her career to education. And yet she had been carrying this incredible burden of guilt for her entire adult life. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Monica Williams, argued that while Sarah's death might have been accidental, Maggie's decision to cover up the crime and lie to investigators for 30 years demonstrated a pattern of calculated deception that warranted serious consequences. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, Williams argued during opening statements. This was a deliberate, sustained effort to evade responsibility for her actions. She didn't just fail to call 911, she buried her best friend's body, lied to everyone who loved Sarah, and built her entire life on that foundation of lies. The defense strategy focused on Maggie's psychological state at the time of the incident, and the genuine remorse she had shown over the years. They argued that the crime had been truly accidental, and that Maggie's decision to cover it up had been the panicked reaction of a young woman who was terrified of the consequences. "My client has been serving a life sentence for 30 years, Chen argued. "She has lived every day with the knowledge of what she did, with the guilt and the shame. She became a better person because of that guilt, not in spite of it. She devoted herself to education, to her family, to her community. She tried to honor Sarah's memory by living the kind of life that Sarah would have wanted her to live." The community response: shock and division. The revelation that Maggie Davidson had murdered her best friend 30 years earlier sent shockwaves through Millbrook Heights. Residents who had known her as a respected educator and community leader struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the person who had been capable of such deception. "I kept thinking there had to be some mistake," said Nancy Peterson, whose daughter had been in Maggie's fourth-grade class 15 years earlier. This was the teacher who stayed after school to help struggling students, who remembered every child's birthday, who cried at graduation ceremonies. How could someone like that be a murderer? The community response was deeply divided. Some residents expressed sympathy for Maggie, viewing her as someone who had made a terrible mistake as a young woman and had spent the rest of her life trying to atone for it. Others were horrified by the deception, feeling betrayed by someone they had trusted with their children's education and their community's well-being. "She fooled all of us," said Tom Richardson, whose son had played Little League baseball with David Davidson. "She was at our barbecues, our kids' birthday parties, our church events. The whole time, she was hiding a body in her basement. It makes you question everything you think you know about people." The psychological impact on those closest to Maggie was particularly severe. Michael Davidson, who had been married to his wife's victim for over 20 years, was hospitalized briefly for stress-related symptoms after learning the truth about Sarah's death. "He's devastated," said his sister, Carol Davidson Phillips, in a statement to the press. "He loved Sarah, grieved for her, and then fell in love with the person who killed her. The betrayal is beyond comprehension. He's not just losing his wife, he's losing his entire understanding of his own life." Emily and David Davidson, now 22 and 19 respectively, withdrew from public view entirely. Friends reported that they were struggling to process not only their mother's crime, but also the realization that their entire family history had been built on a lie. "Those kids are victims too," said Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a trauma counselor who worked with several families affected by the case. "They're dealing with the loss of their mother, the destruction of their family, and the knowledge that someone they loved and trusted was capable of murder and decades of deception. That kind of betrayal trauma can take years to heal." The trial, facing the past. The trial of Margaret Davidson began on October 14, 2019, in Millbrook County Superior Court. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided over proceedings that were attended by members of both Sarah's and Maggie's families, as well as dozens of community members who had been affected by the case. Sarah's parents, Robert and Helen Turner, now in their 70s, attended every day of the trial. They had never stopped hoping that their daughter would be found alive, and learning the truth about her death was both a relief and a devastating blow. "We always wondered," Helen Turner said in her victim impact statement. "For 30 years, we wondered if Sarah was out there somewhere, if she was hurt, if she needed us. The not knowing was torture. But finding out that she died on her birthday, killed by her best friend, while we were at home waiting for a phone call that would never come. I don't have words for that kind of pain." Robert Turner was more direct in his condemnation. Maggie Chin stole our daughter's life, and then she stole 30 years of our grieving. She let us hope when there was no hope. She let us search when there was nothing to find. She comforted us at Sarah's memorial service, knowing she was the reason Sarah was dead. That level of cruelty is unforgivable. The prosecution presented a methodical case, walking the jury through the physical evidence, the DNA analysis, and the detailed confession. They brought in forensic experts who confirmed that Sarah had died from blunt force trauma, and psychologists who testified about the calculated nature of the cover-up. This wasn't a crime of passion, District Attorney Williams argued. Yes, Sarah's death might have been accidental, but everything that happened afterward was deliberate. The defendant chose to let Sarah die when she could have called for help. She chose to bury the body rather than report the accident. She chose to lie to police, to Sarah's family, to her own husband. She chose to build her entire life on the foundation of Sarah Turner's grave. The defense focused heavily on Maggie's mental state and the genuine remorse she had shown throughout her confession and the subsequent investigation. They brought in character witnesses who testified about her contributions to education and the community, arguing that she had tried to live a life that would honor Sarah's memory. My client is not a monster, defense attorney Chen argued. She's a woman who made a terrible mistake at age 24 and has been paying for it every day since. Look at how she lived her life, devoted to helping children, serving her community, trying to be the kind of person that Sarah would have been proud to call a friend. The guilt and remorse have been punishment enough. Perhaps the most compelling testimony came from Maggie herself. Against her attorney's advice, she chose to take the stand and address the court directly. Her testimony lasted for 2 full days and provided the most detailed account of the crime and its aftermath. I want Sarah's family to know that I never meant to hurt her, Maggie said, speaking directly to the Turners. She was the best friend I ever had, even though I was too jealous and bitter to appreciate it at the time. I was angry about things that seem so petty now, a job opportunity, a boyfriend, professional recognition. I let that anger poison our friendship, and in one terrible moment, it cost Sarah her life. She also addressed the 30 years of deception. I know that hiding the truth made everything worse. I tell myself that I was scared, that I was young, that I panicked. But the truth is that once I made the decision to cover up what happened, I was trapped. Every day that passed made it harder to come forward. I built a life on lies, and I knew that telling the truth would destroy not just me, but everyone I loved. The testimony that seemed to have the greatest impact on the jury, however, was Maggie's description of how the secret had affected her daily life. People think I got away with murder for 30 years, but that's not true. I never got away with anything. Sarah was with me every day. When I looked at my children, I thought about the children Sarah would never have. When I celebrated achievements in my career, I remembered that Sarah would never get those opportunities. When I was happy, I felt guilty for being happy. When I was sad, I felt like I deserved to be sad. I lived in a prison of my own making, and Sarah's ghost was my cellmate. The verdict: justice and consequences. After deliberating for 3 days, the jury returned a mixed verdict that reflected the complex nature of the case. They found Maggie Davidson guilty of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, accepting the defense argument that Sarah's death had not been premeditated. However, they also convicted her on all charges related to the cover-up, including tampering with evidence, filing false police reports, and obstruction of justice. The jury recognized that this case was different from a typical murder, explained juror Patricia Mills. who spoke to reporters after the verdict. "We believe that Sarah's death was probably accidental, or at least not planned. But we also felt that the defendant's actions after the death, the lies, the cover-up, the deception that lasted for decades, deserved serious consequences." Judge Hendricks sentenced Maggie Davidson to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 10 years. The sentence was considered relatively lenient by some observers, but Judge Hendricks explained her reasoning during the sentencing hearing. "This court recognizes that the defendant has already served a form of life sentence," Judge Hendricks said. "The evidence shows that she has lived with genuine remorse and has tried to honor the victim's memory through her actions over the past 30 years. However, the law demands accountability, and the victim's family deserves justice. A sentence of imprisonment is necessary to acknowledge the severity of these crimes and to provide closure for all those affected." The sentence also included provisions for restitution to Sarah's family and mandatory counseling for trauma and grief. Maggie would be eligible for work release programs and educational opportunities while incarcerated, recognizing her lack of prior criminal history and her contributions to the community. The aftermath: lives forever changed. The conviction and sentencing of Margaret Davidson marked the end of the legal proceedings, but it was just the beginning of the healing process for the many people affected by her crimes. The case had ripple effects that continued to impact the Millbrook Heights community long after the trial concluded. Michael Davidson filed for divorce while his wife was awaiting sentencing, but friends reported that the decision was made more in sorrow than in anger. "He still loves her," said family friend Susan Martinez. "But he can't reconcile the woman he married with the woman who is capable of this kind of deception. The trust is gone, and without trust, there's no foundation for a marriage." Michael eventually moved to Florida to be closer to his elderly parents, taking early retirement from his teaching position. He rarely spoke publicly about the case, but in one interview with a local newspaper, he expressed the complexity of his feelings. "I mourn for Sarah, who deserved so much better than what happened to her. I mourn for my children, who have to live with this forever. And yes, I mourn for Maggie too, because the woman I fell in love with was real, even if she was carrying this terrible secret. The whole situation is just heartbreaking for everyone involved." Emily and David Davidson both changed their names and relocated to different states to escape the media attention and community scrutiny. Emily, who had been studying education like her mother, switched to social work, saying she wanted to help people heal from trauma instead of perpetuating it. David, who had been considering a career in law enforcement, instead chose to study psychology, hoping to understand the mental processes that could lead someone to commit such acts. They're both in therapy, trying to process not just what their mother did, but what it means about their own identities, explained Dr. Martinez, who continued to work with the family. "They're questioning everything: their memories, their relationships, their understanding of right and wrong. It's going to take time for them to rebuild their sense of self." Sarah's parents, Robert and Helen Turner, expressed mixed feelings about the resolution of the case. While they were grateful to finally know what had happened to their daughter, the knowledge brought its own kind of pain. "We can finally grieve properly," Helen Turner said in a statement. "For 30 years, we held on to hope that Sarah might still be alive somewhere. Now we know she's been gone all this time, and we can say goodbye properly. But we also have to live with the knowledge that she died alone, betrayed by someone she trusted. That's a pain that never goes away." The Turners established a memorial fund in Sarah's name to provide scholarships for education majors, particularly those from low-income families. Sarah wanted to be a teacher because she believed education could change lives. Robert Turner explained, "If something good can come from this tragedy, maybe it's that other young people will get the opportunity to follow their dreams the way Sarah never got to follow hers." The psychological analysis, understanding the unthinkable. The case of Margaret Davidson raised difficult questions about the nature of guilt, remorse, and redemption. Mental health professionals who studied the case were particularly interested in how someone could maintain such an elaborate deception for so long while apparently living a productive and meaningful life. Dr. James Patterson, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case, offered this analysis. "What we see in Maggie Davidson is someone who committed a terrible act and then spent 30 years trying to become the person she thought she should have been all along. The guilt and shame became driving forces in her life, pushing her to be a better teacher, mother, and community member. In a strange way, Sarah's death became the catalyst for Maggie's transformation into a more empathetic and giving person." However, Dr. Patterson was careful to note that this psychological dynamic didn't excuse Maggie's actions. The fact that she used her guilt constructively doesn't erase the harm she caused. Sarah Turner lost her life, her family lost their daughter, and dozens of people were deceived for decades. The psychological toll of living with such a secret may have been significant for Maggie, but it was a burden she chose to carry rather than face the consequences of her actions. The case also highlighted the complex relationship between confession and healing. Religious leaders and therapists who worked with people affected by the case noted that while Maggie's eventual confession brought some measure of closure, it also opened old wounds and created new trauma. Confession can be healing, but it can also be devastating, explained Father Michael O'Brien, who counseled several families affected by the case. Maggie found some peace in finally telling the truth, but that truth destroyed the lives of people who had never done anything wrong. It's a reminder that our actions have consequences that extend far beyond ourselves, sometimes for decades. The media impact, a story that resonated. The case of Margaret Davidson captured national attention, spawning documentaries, podcast series, and countless news articles. The story seemed to tap into deep-seated fears about the people we trust and the secrets that might lie beneath the surface of ordinary suburban life. What made this case so compelling wasn't just the crime itself, but the length of time Maggie was able to maintain her secret, explained Jennifer Walsh, the crime journalist who wrote a book about the case titled The Teacher's Secret. Here was someone who appeared to be the perfect neighbor, the ideal educator, the model citizen. The revelation that she was hiding such a dark secret made people question their own judgment about the people in their lives. The case also sparked discussions about the statute of limitations for crimes, the role of DNA evidence in cold cases, and the psychological impact of long-term deception. Legal experts debated whether someone who had lived productively for 30 years should face the same consequences as someone who committed a crime and was immediately caught. This case challenges our traditional notions of justice, said legal scholar Dr. Amanda Roberts. Do we punish people for who they were 30 years ago, or do we consider who they've become in the intervening years? Maggie Davidson committed a serious crime, but she also spent 3 decades trying to atone for it. The question is whether that attempted atonement should influence how we approach her punishment. The broader implications, trust and community. Beyond the legal and psychological aspects, the Davidson case had broader implications for how communities think about trust, secrets, and the people they choose to rely on. Millbrook Heights, like many small communities, prided itself on being the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and looked out for each other. The revelation that one of their most trusted residents had been hiding such a significant secret shook that foundation. "It makes you wonder what other secrets people are carrying," said longtime resident Tom Richardson. "If Maggie could fool us for 30 years, what else might we be missing? It's changed how I look at people, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing." The case also highlighted the ripple effects of deception and the way that lies, even when motivated by fear or shame, can cause harm that extends far beyond the original crime. Maggie's decision to hide Sarah's death didn't just affect her own life, it impacted Sarah's family, who spent decades wondering what had happened to their daughter. It affected Michael, who unknowingly married his girlfriend's killer. It affected Emily and David, who discovered that their entire family history was built on a lie. "Secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch," observed Dr. Martinez. "Even when people think they're protecting others by keeping quiet, they're often causing more harm than they prevent. The truth might be painful, but deception is almost always worse in the long run." The prison years. Redemption behind bars. Margaret Davidson began serving her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in September 2019. Prison officials reported that she was a model inmate who participated in educational programs, counseled other inmates, and maintained regular correspondence with a small group of supporters from her former community. "She's not the typical inmate," said Warden Patricia Collins. "She's older, well-educated, and clearly carrying a tremendous amount of guilt and remorse. She spends most of her time reading, writing, and helping other inmates with their educational goals. In many ways, she's continued the teaching career that defined her life before her incarceration." Maggie's time in prison was not without challenges. She received death threats from people who believed her sentence was too lenient, and she struggled with depression and anxiety related to her separation from her children. However, she also found unexpected sources of support from other inmates who were serving time for crimes they had committed decades earlier. "There's a whole group of us who are paying for things we did when we were younger," Maggie wrote in a letter to a former colleague. "We talk about guilt, about redemption, about whether it's possible to truly atone for the harm we've caused. I don't know if I'll ever find peace, but I'm trying to use this time to become someone who might deserve forgiveness, even if I never receive it." The most significant development during Maggie's incarceration was her decision to participate in a restorative justice program that allowed her to have facilitated conversations with Sarah's family. The meetings, which took place over video conference due to COVID-19 restrictions, were emotionally intense but ultimately healing for all parties involved. "I needed to hear her tell me, face to face, what happened to my daughter," Helen Turner explained after the sessions. "I needed to see her remorse, to understand why she made the choices she made. It didn't erase the pain, but it helped me find some closure." The children's journey, healing from betrayal. Perhaps no one was more profoundly affected by Maggie's crimes than her own children, Emily and David Davidson. Both young adults struggled to reconcile their memories of a loving, supportive mother with the knowledge of what she had done. Emily, who was 22 when her mother was arrested, initially refused to have any contact with Maggie. "I felt like my entire childhood was a lie," she explained in a rare interview 3 years after the trial. "Every bedtime story, every homework session, every mother-daughter talk, it all felt contaminated by the knowledge of what she had done. I didn't know how to separate the mother I loved from the person who was capable of murder." However, Emily eventually began therapy and slowly worked toward understanding her complex feelings about her mother. "I realized that hating her wasn't helping me heal," she said. "The mother who raised me was real, even if she was carrying this terrible secret. I had to find a way to acknowledge both parts of who she was, the caring educator and community member, and the person who made an unforgivable mistake and then compounded it with decades of lies." David, who was 19 at the time of the arrest, took a different approach. He maintained regular contact with his mother throughout her incarceration, visiting her monthly and participating in family therapy sessions via video conference. "I love my mom," David said simply. "What she did was wrong, and I understand why she has to face consequences for it. But she's still the person who taught me to ride a bike, who stayed up all night when I was sick, who cheered at my baseball games. I can't just erase 20 years of love because of something that happened before I was born." Both children eventually testified at Maggie's parole hearing in 2024, providing statements about how their mother's crime and subsequent imprisonment had affected their lives. Their testimony was considered crucial in the parole board's decision-making process. The parole hearing, facing the future. Margaret Davidson became eligible for parole in October 2024, after serving 5 years of her 15-year sentence. The parole hearing was attended by members of Sarah's family, Maggie's children, and several community members who had been affected by the case. The hearing provided an opportunity for Maggie to address the parole board directly about her remorse, her rehabilitation, and her plans for the future. Her statement was widely considered to be one of the most emotionally compelling parts of the proceedings. "I understand that some people believe I should serve my full sentence," Maggie told the board. "I accept that judgment. What I did, both the original crime and the decades of deception that followed, caused immeasurable harm to people who deserved better from me. I can never undo that harm, but I can commit to spending whatever time I have left trying to be worthy of the second chance that life has given me." She outlined her plans for post-incarceration life, including her intention to work with organizations that support families of missing persons and to speak publicly about the psychological toll of keeping secrets. "I want to use my experience to help others understand that hiding from the truth only makes things worse," she explained. "If my story can prevent even one person from making the choices I made, then maybe some good can come from this tragedy." The parole board also heard testimony from Sarah's parents, who had evolved in their thinking about Maggie's punishment over the 5 years since her conviction. While they still believed that she should face consequences for her actions, they supported her release on parole. "We've had 5 years to process our anger and grief," Robert Turner told the board. "We've seen genuine remorse from Maggie, and we've seen how her incarceration has affected her children, who are also victims in this situation. We believe that justice has been served, and that continuing to punish her won't bring Sarah back or heal our family's wounds." The parole board voted 4-1 to grant Maggie's release, with the condition that she serve 3 years of supervised probation and complete 500 hours of community service focused on victim advocacy. She was released from prison on November 15, 2024, after serving 5 years and 2 months of her sentence. Life after prison, the challenge of redemption. Margaret Davidson's release from prison marked the beginning of a new chapter in a story that had captivated the public for over 5 years. Now 63 years old, she faced the challenge of rebuilding her life while living with the permanent consequences of her actions. Her first priority was re-establishing relationships with her children, both of whom had moved to different states, and were building lives independent of their family's notoriety. Emily, now 27 and working as a social worker in Colorado, maintained limited contact with her mother but was slowly working toward forgiveness through continued therapy. "I'm not ready for a full relationship yet," Emily explained. "But I'm open to the possibility that we might find our way back to each other eventually. She's still my mother, and despite everything, I want her to find peace." David, now 24 and pursuing a graduate degree in psychology, was more receptive to rebuilding their relationship. "She's paid her debt to society," he said. "Now she has to live with the consequences of her choices for the rest of her life. I want to be part of helping her do that in a positive way." Maggie settled in a small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, far from Millbrook Heights but close enough to her children that visits were possible. She found work as a literacy tutor for adult learners, a position that allowed her to use her educational background while maintaining a low profile. "I know I'll never have the kind of career or community standing I had before," she acknowledged. "That's part of the price I pay for my choices. But I can still contribute in small ways, still help people learn and grow. That has to be enough." The ongoing impact, a community forever changed. 5 years after Margaret Davidson's arrest, Millbrook Heights was still grappling with the implications of the case. The community had been forced to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, judgment, and the secrets that people might be hiding behind seemingly perfect facades. "It changed how we look at each other," admitted Patricia Holmes, Maggie's former neighbor. "Not in a paranoid way, but in a more realistic way. We realized that we might not know our neighbors as well as we thought we did. It made us more cautious about who we trust, but also more compassionate about the struggles people might be facing in private." The case had also led to changes in how local law enforcement approached cold cases and missing persons investigations. The Millbrook Heights Police Department implemented new protocols for reviewing old cases and following up on inconsistencies that might have been overlooked in initial investigations. "The Davidson case taught us that we need to be more thorough in our investigations, even when dealing with seemingly cooperative witnesses," explained Detective Rodriguez, who had been promoted to sergeant in recognition of her work on the case. "People can be very convincing when they're lying, especially when they have years to perfect their stories." The case also prompted discussions about the role of DNA evidence in solving cold cases and the ethical implications of using genetic genealogy to identify suspects. While most people supported the use of these technologies to solve crimes, some raised concerns about privacy and the potential for misuse. Lessons learned: the price of secrets. The story of Margaret Davidson serves as a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of secrets and the way that lies, even when motivated by fear or shame, can cause harm that extends far beyond the original crime. Her case illustrates several important lessons about guilt, redemption, and the long-term consequences of our choices. First, the case demonstrates that there is no such thing as a perfect crime. Despite Maggie's careful planning and decades of successful deception, advances in technology and investigative techniques eventually caught up with her. The DNA evidence that led to her arrest was collected in 1993 but couldn't be analyzed until 2018. Time, rather than being her ally, ultimately became her enemy. Second, the case shows how guilt and shame can become driving forces in someone's life, leading them to both positive and negative behaviors. Maggie's remorse over Sarah's death motivated her to become a better teacher, mother, and community member, but it also trapped her in a web of lies that ultimately caused more harm than the original crime. Third, the case illustrates the ripple effects of deception and the way that lies can poison relationships and communities. Maggie's decision to hide Sarah's death didn't just affect her own life. It impacted everyone who loved Sarah, everyone who loved Maggie, and everyone who trusted her with their children's education and their community's well-being. Finally, the case raises difficult questions about forgiveness, redemption, and second chances. Can someone who commits a serious crime and then lives productively for decades earn forgiveness? Does the passage of time and evidence of genuine remorse change how we should approach justice? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they're questions that every society must grapple with. The final chapter, understanding and moving forward. As this story draws to a close, it's important to acknowledge that there are no clear heroes or villains in the case of Margaret Davidson. Sarah Turner was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, who died because of a moment of anger and jealousy. She deserved better than what happened to her, and her family deserved the truth about her fate. Margaret Davidson was a flawed human being who made a terrible mistake and then compounded it with decades of deception. But she was also someone who genuinely tried to honor her victim's memory by living a life of service and contribution. Her story is both tragic and instructive, showing us how guilt and shame can shape a life in both positive and destructive ways. The families and communities affected by this case were all victims in their own ways, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, judgment, and the people they thought they knew. Their pain and confusion were real and valid, and their journey toward healing and understanding continues. Perhaps the most important lesson from this case is that the truth, however painful, is almost always better than lies. Maggie Davidson spent 30 years trying to protect herself and others from the consequences of her actions, but her deception ultimately caused more harm than honesty would have. If she had called 911 on September 15, 1993, Sarah might have survived. If she had told the truth immediately after Sarah's death, the pain would have been intense but brief. Instead, her lies created a wound that festered for decades, affecting dozens of lives in ways that can never be fully healed. The case also reminds us that redemption is possible, even after the most serious mistakes. Maggie Davidson will spend the rest of her life living with the consequences of her choices, but she has also shown that it's possible to use guilt and remorse as motivation for positive change. Her story doesn't excuse her actions, but it does illustrate the complex nature of human psychology and the possibility for growth and transformation, even in the darkest circumstances. As we consider this case and its implications, we're left with challenging questions about justice, forgiveness, and the nature of human behavior. These are questions that don't have simple answers, but they're questions worth contemplating as we try to understand ourselves and the people around us. Epilogue, a question for reflection. The story of Margaret Davidson and Sarah Turner is ultimately a story about choices and consequences, about the weight of secrets and the power of truth. It's a story that challenges our assumptions about the people we trust and the judgments we make about human behavior. As you reflect on this case, consider this question: what would have happened if Maggie had never confessed? She had successfully hidden her crime for 30 years, and there's no guarantee that the DNA evidence would have led to her arrest. She might have lived out her days as a respected community member, taking her secret to the grave. Would that have been a better outcome for everyone involved? The answer to that question reveals something about your own values and beliefs about truth, justice, and redemption. There's no right or wrong answer, but it's a question worth pondering as we consider the complex moral landscape that this case represents. In the end, The story of Margaret Davidson serves as a reminder that we are all capable of both great good and terrible harm, sometimes within the same life, sometimes even motivated by the same events. The challenge is to learn from stories like this one, to understand the warning signs and moral pitfalls that can lead ordinary people to make extraordinary mistakes, and to find ways to build communities and relationships based on honesty, compassion, and genuine understanding. The truth may be painful, but it's the foundation upon which all meaningful relationships and communities must be built. Margaret Davidson learned that lesson 30 years too late, but perhaps her story can help others learn it in time to make different choices.